President Donald Trump is no longer president of the United States. But what kind of legacy will he be leaving for the American people? And what should the conservative movement and Republican Party take away as lessons? We're going to talk about it with David Bahnsen today on Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. And Jimmy at the Crossroads with yours truly, Jimmy Sengenberger, starts right now.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads. Once again, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, now in the year 2021. And it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be back with you today here on this very program where we like to make sense out of nonsense and get to the heart of the matter. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. By the way, if you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel, please do, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads, and like the Facebook page, Jimmy Sengenberger Media Personality. You can also watch the program there and subscribe to the podcast, now available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. And of course, be sure to follow our friends and partners at the Washington Examiner at WashingtonExaminer.com. Now today, as we have President Joe Biden in office, I think it's very important to have some discussions about what's going on in terms of the legacy being left behind by President Trump and where things stand now for the conservative movement, the Republican Party, the center right, whatever terminology you want to use. There is a tremendous new piece that came out earlier this week in the National Review by David Bahnsen entitled A Final Assessment of the Trump Presidency and the Path Forward. David Bahnsen is the founder, managing partner, and CIO of the Bahnsen Group. He's also a trustee for the National Review Institute and author of the book Crisis of Responsibility. And he joins me now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. David, sir, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy. It's good to be with you.
It's great to have you here. It is a difficult time for the American people, and there are a lot of things I think we need to suss out from this last election and where President Trump left things. And I thought your essay for National Review was quite fascinating because you struck on a lot of different points, from the good that President Trump brought, especially in a lot of policy areas, but also some of the drawbacks. And you really go into depth on some aspects of the drawbacks. And I'm curious as to why you felt so strongly that you wanted to get your voice into the conversation.
Well, I think that my voice, speaking for myself personally, but also for a certain segment of the right, has been a minority position that has largely been unvoiced. It's lacked a microphone. There's been two temperatures, so to speak, that have gotten a lot of play around Trump throughout the Trump years. Either those that I don't think I'm being exaggerative to say are borderline sycophantic. I mean, extraordinarily pro-Trump from A to Z, and have used their microphone to promote that view of Trump the man, Trump the mission, Trump the achievements, and so forth. But then the other voice has been this sort of never Trumper and sometimes really deranged views that has never been able to acknowledge any good, any positive direction, and so forth. And because from the very early stages of his campaign, all the way through the campaign and eventually his successful election 2016, and then really year by year by year throughout this term in office, my view has been this somewhat nuanced and frankly unpopular view that is kind of neither of the above. I have not believed he was Hitler, and I have not believed that he was the worst human being who ever lived, and I have not believed that every single thing he did was perfect for the country. And so to take a view that said, hey, he just got some really good judges appointed on one hand, and then a couple weeks later to say, hey, this particular action or policy or appointment is really kind of negative or not constructive. Calling balls and strikes. It's something that my friend Ben Shapiro has referred to as the sometimes Trumper movement. There were always Trumpers, never Trumpers, and I don't think that the sometimes Trumpers got a whole lot of air over the last 4 years. It doesn't make for great media. The answer to your question, to really shorten up what you're asking of me, is I felt that the article I wrote, the essay I wrote, National Review, was important because now as we prepare for post-Trump experience, there is a divide between those two camps that I wanted to come and attempt to bridge with truth and with empathy. And that's what I tried to do in my article.
I think the number one reason why your piece for the National Review resonated with me so much, David Bahnsen, is that for me, I'm very much similar to your vantage point in the sense that throughout the Trump presidency, I was willing to criticize him when I thought that he was wrong on things. For example, on my old morning show, Business for Breakfast, you and I had many conversations about Trump's trade war against China, which I was very critical of, and a number of other things where they would pop up, but I would say, you know what, I don't agree with this, and here's why, and explain that. And I actually think that while the media didn't give very much attention to that, let's have a little bit more nuance in viewing Trump position, that there actually is maybe even a majority of people who do agree with where we're coming from, average Americans in particular, but they're not the ones, as you pointed out, who are getting the microphone and the airtime because it's not the fire and brimstone one way or the other kind of thing.
I agree. And I think that when we limit ourselves to just analyzing the policies that may have been negative or unconstructive, we kind of miss the point about what really needs to be said regarding the policies that we might possibly have agreed with. So I happen to be on the same side that you are regarding the trade issue. But let's say someone believed that we needed to reconstruct our trade deals with China and that tariffs were the way to do it. And maybe they even wrongly believed that the Chinese pay that tax, not Americans. Okay, the merits or lack thereof of protective tariffs is at least a legitimate conversation in the realm of public policy. But see, my point would be to those who say, hey, at least he's standing up to China. Well, no, he's not anymore. And the reason he's not is because of his behavior, because that man would have been reelected substantially if he had been able to curtail his worst instincts. So the petulant behavior that was always held up as in dichotomy from the policies, ultimately the policies were undermined for good or for bad by that behavior. His inability to expand the coalition is really unheard of in American presidential politics. Everybody has a base that represents their core enthusiasm that either makes or breaks their candidacy. Trump had an incredibly passionate base, but he did not add a person to it. And that was really, unfortunately, entirely intentional.
Well, to what extent is that true, though? Because I've seen data that suggests that when you look at minority communities, President Trump did perform better in the black community and the Hispanic community, for example, but it was often suburban whites that started to turn away from President Trump.
Yeah, that's a fair point. When I say didn't add a person, I do mean on a net basis. And so there would be a certain percentage of suburban white women that he had and lost that substantially overcompensates for on the margin, the number of black and brown voters he may have added. There's no evidence that the black and brown voters he added helped carry any states other than some of the brown voting population of Florida. By brown, I mean it's inclusive of not just Hispanic, but I mean specifically Cuban, Honduran, Venezuelan, for pretty understandable reasons there. Nobody hates socialism more than people who used to live in socialism. But on the African-American vote, I do think that he gained on the margin. And this is the problem: is we sit around celebrating when we go from getting 5% to 7%. You know, there was not a meaningful moving of the needle. The reality, though, I'm referring to on a net basis, is by a large margin he traded away those constituencies. And here's the other thing I'd point out on an electoral college basis. To the extent that the Rust Belt and the states that he won in 2016, some of which he won in 2020, and even the ones he lost, he almost won. That represents kind of a new terrain that brought back some of these states that Romney and McCain had not won. Fair enough. But you also have to now look at that he traded away some of the Southwest because Colorado went from in play to not in play. Nevada went from pretty favorable to much less favorable. And then most strikingly of all is that Arizona actually flipped and currently has 2 Democrat senators, and that Trump actually lost for the only second time since the 1940s.
Yeah, it is striking, some of, especially in the West, and I'm here in Colorado, and you're apt to point out that Colorado had shifted over the course of the presidency, and Senator Cory Gardner got absolutely shellacked by John Hickenlooper, now U.S. Senator, in a way that I didn't think was possible in terms of the gap. I thought, probably Hickenlooper would win, but...
It's important to point out, and you know this better in your own state than I do, but I believe Gardner lost by 6 percentage points, which is pretty big margin.
9, I
Trump
think.
Lost by 13 points.
Yeah.
And so Trump's loss in Colorado was more than double what Senator Gardner's loss was. And I think on a percentage basis, and that speaks to the reality of how he played in some of those Southwest states, including ones that have picked up a lot of people from other states, and just incredible population growth of young professionals in Denver. So again, to the extent that we picked up some old Reagan Democrats in Rust Belt states, I want to make an argument to those voters. I want to have a message to blue collar Americans, but there should be no reason for us to forfeit other demographics geographically and constituencies. And unfortunately, that's exactly what I think a lot of Trump's behavior did.
Talking with David Bahnsen here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I want to get to your fundamental point in just a moment about the former president's personality and how that may have negatively impacted his policy agenda. But let's talk about the policy agenda for a moment in terms of the good things that he accomplished. Briefly, David, what are some of the highlights of the Trump presidency from a policy success standpoint? Because I certainly think there are plenty of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly myself as a constitutionalist and one who believes that holding the line of the judicial branch of government is paramount for the protection of our republic. Look, I don't mean to footnote this. I don't want to take anything away, but I don't think President Trump cared about this very much. I don't think this is something that animated him personally, but that really doesn't matter. He got it done. I make a point in my article of saying I really don't understand why big fans of the president who point this out all the time, fairly and rightly, also sometimes are so critical of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who really was just a champion at advancing the president's judicial appointments, not only the 3 that got through the Supreme Court, not only what he did to hold off the Merrick Garland Obama appointment, but over 200 federal judges as well. But either way, I'm perfectly willing to put this, as I did in my article, front and center of what I think is the long-term resume of the president. From a pure policy standpoint, I'm a huge advocate of a more competitive corporate tax environment, and I think that legislation was net good. I don't think the individual tax side of it was all that particularly needle moving, but the corporate tax side was important and long overdue. And then I think economically, he deserves all the credit that he's gotten for substantial amount of deregulatory activity. I think that his deregulatory efforts in energy and financials were very constructive. Ironically, he supported a kind of re-regulatory climate with some healthcare, and I don't think that proved to be very constructive. But net, I think that we have a less regulated federal government than we did 4 years ago. And I give the president kudos for that.
But to what extent in the regulatory side can Joe Biden actually quickly overturn what President Trump did? Because there are some areas, for example, early on in the presidency when Trump had both the Republicans in control of both the Senate and the House, they used the Congressional Review Act 15 different times to permanently repeal a number of regulations. But there were many things that he did that technically could be undone or put back into place by the Biden administration. In fact, we're seeing that already in some areas in terms of not necessarily regulatory, but also with the Keystone Pipeline and the Paris Climate Accord and what have you. So what do you make of that real briefly?
Well, it's completely true. That's one of the big drawbacks of when you use a big executive branch instead of through the actual how a bill becomes a law activity that our founders intended. Anything that can be done with the stroke of a pen can be undone with the stroke of a pen in executive branch of government. However, some of these things have a way of working their way through the system and having a little bit longer term impact. For example, the discretionary side of how Health and Human Services was able to allocate resources, that the support they were able to get to certain pro-life organizations, that's not easily undone. You know, there were things done there that have a lasting impact. Even on the financial side, there's no question they're going to try to re-regulate some of the financial sector, but they can't do it immediately. It's going to take some time to get people into the bureaucracy. And so just as the slow wheels of bureaucracy took time to kind of fix some things, they will take a little time to unfix some things. But you're right, there was very little legislation that got done. And the same is true during the Obama administration. The worst things that happened and when I say worse, I mean from my vantage point as a conservative, they were mostly things that could get undone. Obamacare is the great exception because it was what? Legislation. And so I think that ultimately the permanent type things that Trump got done are more on the Supreme Court side, and the things that I still like but are, as you point out, more temporal were more regulatory. But things like Biden already undoing the Paris Climate Accord and so forth, there's a lot more symbolism than substance, both when we left it and when we rejoined it.
True.
Ultimately, I think that we need a better legislator to get permanent things done.
Right.
But I do appreciate the deregulatory initiatives the president got accomplished.
And I would add other things. I know that his foreign policy was a mixed bag, but on the Middle East peace process, I think that Biden's going to find a more difficult time, for example, restoring the Iran nuclear deal than he would have had Trump not advanced Middle East peace in the way that he had, and a number of other areas as well. But there's one point that you make, and in our last few moments with you, David Bahnsen, I want to underscore this one. I want to read a sentence from your piece, A Final Assessment of the Trump Presidency and the Path Forward. Quote, "The temperament and behavior could not be ignored for the greater good because the greater good to which you refer failed as a result of the temperament and behavior." Talk to us about the role of President Trump's behavior and personality vis-a-vis his policy agenda.
Well, I think that he essentially forfeited a lot of the moral authority that the bully pulpit of the presidency allows. That there was a hesitancy to work with him in Congress. There was after the midterms in particular, there was much less of a political mandate for the other side of the aisle to work with him to get things done. And you could argue, well, they were just obstructionists to begin with. They were never going to give him a victory. And that's all well and good, but how much of that is a self-fulfilling prophecy? I could have gone through, and I didn't in my article, throughout the presidency, I kind of kept an itemization of not the highlights, but really the lowlights of some of the behavioral things. And I assure you that there was a lot of material, 2016, 17, 18, 19. And I didn't use any of it in my piece, Jimmy, because 2020 represented the moments that I will never understand. During the height of the COVID pandemic, the president chose to use those press conferences in which the country was clearly frustrated, many people scared, many people not understanding what was going on. But regardless of what the right posture needed to be medically and so forth, the point was people were locked down. It was a national lockdown that he had instituted. And yet, in that moment, he chose to use those press conferences to get in a daily fight with reporters. Now, I don't like any of those reporters, but see, they're reporters. He's the president, and he had an opportunity to rise to the occasion. That's what leadership does. His position of political capital, and again, I do think the phrase moral authority is an accurate one, was unbelievably diminished as we went through the social unrest of the summer, as we went through more controversy as to what the national policy portfolio needed to look like around COVID. He was tweeting about his ratings. He was tweeting about Joe Scarborough killing an intern. Okay, it was unhinged and it was totally unacceptable. And I would say that about anybody, but especially the President of the United States. It cost him the election, and it cost him the ability to implement his own policy agenda in the final months and quarters of his presidency.
And so the final point that I want you to address relative to that before we let you go, David Bahnsen, is that you would have many people who would say, you know, he gives it to the media. He's a fighter. He doesn't take any punches. He'll throw it right back. But what you're arguing is that that quality that a lot of people liked about him went too far and undermined the objectives that he could have achieved more expansively than he did in terms of policy.
Yes, and that concluding sentence is the important part, because when you say went too far, it almost sounds like he had too much good intentions. He was fighting with the media against wokeism and against cancel culture and against socialism too hard. But see, he wasn't. Joe Scarborough murdering an intern was not him standing up against media leftism. Okay, him tweeting to brag about his ratings during COVID was not him standing up against Cuomo or de Blasio. The whole point was it was narcissism. It was a distraction from his agenda. And so the idea of fighting against the media, standing up in the severity of the moment, would have commanded him to have the character traits that we want our kids to have: self-control, poise. I am all for a fighter, but what I think we need is a fighter who's fighting in the moment for the mission, not just for their own self. And I don't think the president was ever able to put himself below the country. And that ultimately is really what played out.
And you flesh out all these points and more very intriguingly, I would say, in this piece for the National Review, a final assessment of the Trump presidency and the path forward. I strongly encourage folks to check it out. David Bahnsen, thank you so much for joining us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I really appreciate the time and great insights in the article.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Good to be with you again.
Thank you. Once again, David Bahnsen joining us here on the program. He is founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group. He's a trustee for the National Review Institute, the author of a few different books, including Crisis of Responsibility. And I have to tell you that I really did find his article insightful in a number of ways. Again, it's for the National Review, a final assessment of the Trump presidency and the path forward, an extensive essay evaluating the Trump presidency, the good and the bad, sort of where we go from here. He describes it, I think, as the path forward. And something that he identifies is that there are a number of policy achievements from the Trump administration. I mean, make no mistake, what President Trump did with the judiciary was genuinely historic and truly remarkable. And he did that in tandem with Mitch McConnell as Senate Majority Leader, but he reshaped the judiciary with 3 Supreme Court justices who have life tenure now and are quite young. I believe all 3 of them are the youngest on the bench by far. So you had the Supreme Court, but you also had the lower court appointments. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, reshaped by President Trump. If I recall correctly, before he took office, there were 11 more Democrat-appointed judges on the Ninth Circuit in California than Republican-appointed judges. Now there are only 3 more Democrat-appointed judges on the Ninth Circuit than Republican-appointed judges. That's remarkable. So many tremendous appointments. Middle East peace, we've talked about in this program a number of times. Middle East peace is a hallmark of the Trump administration. What President Trump and his team did, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Jared Kushner, and others in the Middle East was remarkable vis-a-vis the countries that came on board firmly with Israel and signed peace agreements, and those countries like Saudi Arabia that had opened up more throughout the course of Trump's presidency, opened up more to conversations with Israel to the point where the stage may be set for peace before we know it. And repealing the Iran nuclear deal and then achieving those peace gains in the Middle East was a great combination, because it means Biden's going to have a much more difficult time overturning that Iran deal repeal, because the dynamics and the nature of the Middle East has changed. And the Trump team recognized that, acted accordingly, and made those game-changing moves permanent and not easily undone by Biden. That's remarkable. You look at the deregulatory regime, a lot of those things can stay. Some of them can be undone by Biden. But at least Biden's now going to have to, if you're going to institute new regulations, there's a process that has to go into play. So I think it's going to take time for him to restore any of the regulations that Trump was successful at removing. You can also look at some of the environmental gains, the Great American Outdoors Act. You look at the First Step Act and criminal justice reform, a whole slew of areas of success by President Trump, some of which Bahnsen discusses in his article, some of which he does not. But here's the thing. He makes a very fascinating and I think important point about the role of President Trump's personality and his tweets and the way in which he constantly was picking fights that, if you look at them in the macro, what he's trying to achieve really, did he accomplish anything with a lot of those spats? I would contend and agree with Bahnsen that no, he didn't. Instead, what it made a lot of people think was that, we have someone who's acting more childlike in certain ways. And I think that's a valid point. Not to say that President Trump always acted that way or didn't mostly fight the good fight for the right reasons or with the right sort of objective to achieve. Because I certainly think in many cases he did exactly that. We needed somebody who would take it to the media and take it to the Democrats and not just lay down and let them run roughshod over a Republican president. That's good on the part of President Trump. But it did go too far with so many of these petty squabbles, culminating in that first presidential debate, which Bahnsen says in his piece is the day that Trump lost his candidacy. Or at least it would be hard for him to recover from that, because he really just acted in a way I don't know anybody. Okay, that's not true. There were a couple people I know who liked how Trump performed then, but almost nobody appreciated it, certainly people in the middle. And you have to wonder, why did he think that tearing into Biden in such a way where he wouldn't even allow his opponent to get a word in edgewise was the right strategy? The second debate, Trump knocked it out of the park. There was no comparison. He did a fantastic job. But in the second debate, he had already undermined himself by the first debate. And that's no small matter, because the first debate really brought out a lot of the things that people were critical of in terms of his personality. It's one thing, as Bahnsen points out, to have fight in you, to push for your agenda and to push back against the left and to fight against the media. It's one thing to do that. But it is another thing. It is another matter when that consumes your presidency. And that's what you're known for. In fact, if we go to the Trump legacy more than anything, and I don't like this because there's so many things that the president accomplished that he should be known and remembered for, but now he's going to be remembered as the first president in history to be impeached twice, possibly removed from office after being removed from office, that is to say, prevented in essence from running again, and the siege on the Capitol on on January 6th. That was absolutely inexcusable, fundamentally wrong, and downright horrifying seeing that happen. And I think that there were things that President Trump did in the lead up to January 6th that contributed to it evolving the way that it did. But I don't think that the language he used at that rally incited the event. I don't think he actually incited directly what happened at the Capitol in terms of the siege. But he is going to be remembered for that. Not Middle East peace. Not the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Not the Supreme Court legacy. Not anything. Except for, like Nixon and Watergate, the last week and a half of Trump's presidency. That's what he's going to be remembered for. And I think that that is sort of a representation of this personality issue that David Bahnsen identifies. Because if it's all about an in-your-face personality that really is constantly going to pick fights and all that, then it can lead to a memory for people of just the personality. They're not going to recognize the achievements, which are plentiful. And then also by allowing himself to get in the way, like he got in his own way, time after time after time. That's what Donald Trump did, was he got in his own way of his own agenda with his own tweets or statements on television and in the news or at press conference, so on and so forth. Donald Trump made it more difficult for him to leave a legacy of achievement and for him to get policy goals accomplished. And that's an unfortunate state of affairs, especially as someone who found a lot of good in this administration that we just left behind. We'll see where we go from here, but these lessons are important because, look, Donald Trump won on a sort of populist message of, I'm going to fight for you, the working man, the forgotten man and woman. That was his expression. The forgotten man and woman. I'm going to fight for you because you have been left behind. And that message resonates because there's so much to it. It's so important. There's a lot of truth to it. So Republicans certainly need to look at Trump and see the things that he brought about in terms of a fighting spirit, giving a backbone to Republicans in Congress on some things was tremendous. Like the Supreme Court over Kavanaugh, for example, or Amy Coney Barrett. I really think that Trump helped get that spine up so that Republicans would keep it going and would not give up and not surrender those particular fights. That's good. That's a good quality we need in a center-right coalition. You also need to advance an agenda that will help working people. And that's something that President Trump also tapped into. And a bold policy agenda. There were some issues that Trump ran on, whether you agree with him or not, that were pretty clear. He managed to build a lot of his campaign around trade and immigration, for example, in 2016. That's a lesson to take home positively from President Trump in his tenure. However, on the other hand, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind as well. Is not to let that personality go too far, especially if it is in such a way that can turn people off. Having a fighting spirit is one thing. Constantly just going at it for the sake of going at it with other people is another thing entirely. But we talked about that already. That's a lesson. Another lesson is to really focus on issues that matter and the agenda. I mean, look at COVID-19. News reports are saying that President Trump may not have left behind a vaccine distribution plan. I don't know the veracity of those claims as of the taping of this show. But what I do know is that there is more of a steady hand that he could have brought in terms of just the messaging side and in terms of some of the strategy when it comes to reassuring Americans about this virus. That would have been better, but it is an example of the president not focusing as much on policy, which in some ways I think was good, in the sense that he appointed really good people. And this is something else Bahnsen mentions in his piece. He appointed really good people to positions like Education Secretary, EPA, Energy Secretary, Secretary of State, and then said, go do what you're good at. I gave you a job, now go fulfill it. And when he gave them those licenses and he appointed somebody good for those roles, then he had tremendous success accomplished because they were given that latitude and they were the right people for the job. So having the right people is important, but also making sure that you are gearing your administration, whatever position you're in, president, governor, or if you're a senator or what have you, you're gearing it towards not just let me get attention, let me get spotlight, let me get my words highlighted, but let's actually advance the ball. And I think that's something we need to emphasize more in the center right. Certainly there are other lessons, and I definitely recommend that you check out David Bahnsen's article, but those are some things that I look at in terms of the Trump legacy and things that we can and should learn from his presidency. A lot of good, though, especially stopping Hillary Clinton, getting those Supreme Court justices on board, and the other lower court judges, completely rebalancing the judiciary, and also the Middle East piece. I mean, those are the three biggest achievements that I think go to President Trump, and you could put in the deregulatory efforts that he's gotten there. But there certainly is a lot. Unfortunately, people won't talk about it too much, and that goes to the personality side and the sense of chaos that often was brought about. But we'll see where things go from here. For now, we're going to be dealing with a Biden administration, and already I am not pleased about that in any way, shape, or form. What he's already proposed in terms of student loans, I got a piece from Newsweek about that this week. What he's proposed in terms of the stimulus package and bringing us back into the Paris Climate Accord and ending the Keystone Pipeline. The list goes on for negative, bad things that Joe Biden is already doing. We're going to keep tabs on all of that here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. It is certainly unfortunate that he is now president of the United States from my vantage point, to be sure. But here on this program, we're always doing our level best to make sense of nonsense. America, folks, is at a crossroads. Now more than ever, we need Jimmy at the Crossroads, and we're coming back with more content and more exciting things to come. So be sure to tune in, keep tabs, subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts, and to the YouTube channel and Facebook page. That is it for us today. Thanks so much for joining us, being a part of the program today. I appreciate your support. Share the video, too. We appreciate that, too. And my thanks to David Bahnsen for joining us here today on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Have a great rest of your day, and as always, may God bless America.